This is Mr. Mullins, and today the lesson will be over simplifying square roots. Now, square roots are numbers multiplied times themselves to give us another number. So in this case, the square root of 9 is equal to 3, because 3 times 3 equals 9. Or the square root of 16 is 4, because 4 times 4 equals 16. Those are what we call perfect square roots. But what about a number like 32? And we want to find the square root of 32. Now, the square root of 32 will not be a whole number. If we use a calculator, it will give us a decimal approximation. But sometimes we want to just simplify. So how will we simplify the square root of 32? Well, the first thing we will do is we will find the factor pairs for the number 32 by using what is called the T-chart. We'll start with 1 and multiply or divide 32 by 1 to find the factor that you multiply times 1 to get 32, and that number is 32. Then we'll try whole numbers starting with 1, and we'll move to 2, and then we'll try 3, and then we'll try 4, and we'll keep trying those whole numbers beginning with 1, finding the whole number factors until we repeat a pair of factors, and then we stop. So when we try 2, 2 times 16 is 32. 4 times 8 is 32. We skipped over 3 because 3 doesn't divide evenly into 32. 8 times 4 is 32. But 8 times 4 is we already found in 4 times 8. So we'll stop. Now we're interested in the pair that has a perfect square. In fact, the pair of factors that has the largest perfect square. Now I notice that 1 is a perfect square, and 4 is a perfect square, but so is 16. So 16 is the largest perfect square. So 2 and 16 is the pair of factors that we're interested in. And so we'll break down 32 to 16 times 2. But then that square root of 16 times 2 can be broken down to the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. Now we know what the square root of 16 is. The square root of 16 is 4. But the square root of 2 is not a perfect square root. So we'll just write down as it is the square root of 2. So 4 times the square root of 2 is the simplified form of the square root of 32. Let's look at another example. Let's simplify the square root of 675. And again, we want to find all the factor pairs of 675, beginning with 1. 1 times 675. 2 doesn't divide evenly, but 3 does. 3 times 225. 4 doesn't divide evenly, but 5 does. 5 times 135. 6 doesn't. 7 doesn't. 8 doesn't. 9 doesn't. And in fact, the next one after 5 is 15. So 15 times 45 is 675. And then the last pair is 25 and 27. So that's all of the factor pairs of 675. And now we're interested in the pair of factors that has the largest perfect square. Well, 1 is a perfect square, 25 is a perfect square, but the largest is 225. So we're going to break down 675 to 3 times 225, because we're finding the pair with the largest perfect square. Now we'll break down the square root of 225 times 3 to the square root of 225 times the square root of 3. And we can find that the square root of 225 is 15. But the square root of 3 does not have a perfect square root, so we just write it as it is. So 675, the square root of 675, is simplified as 15 times the square root of 3. Another example, the square root of 48. We'll find the factor pairs of 48, just like before. 1 times 48, 2 times 24, 3 times 16, 4 times 12, 6 times 8. And that's all of the factor pairs. Now we'll look for the pair with the largest perfect square, and that is 3 times 16. We'll break down 48 to 16 times 3. So the square root of 16 times 3 is broken down to the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. Now we know the square root of 16 is 4. The 3 has no perfect square root, so we'll just write down the square root of 3 as it is. So the square root of 48 is simplified to 4 times the square root of 3. One last example. 128. We want to find the square root, or the simplified form of the square root of 128. Again, we'll find all the factor pairs. 1 times 128, 2 times 64, 4 times 32, 8 times 16. Now, there are 2 perfect squares that are pretty large. There is 2 times 64 and 8 times 16. But we want the largest perfect square, and that is 64. So the pair that we're interested in is 2 times 64. We'll break down 128 to 64 times 2. Then we'll break the square root of 64 times 2 to the square root of 64 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 64 is 8. And 2 has no perfect square root, so we'll just write it down as it is. So the simplified version of the square root of 128 is 8 times the square root of 2.